So hello everyone, I'm Chloe Uden, I'm from the Art and Energy Collective, and I'm joined today by Dr. Rebecca Chasey from Sustained Psychology. Hello Becky, Rebecca, what shall we
You can
call
call me
you?
Becky today. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. Lovely to see you.
Oh, it's really great that you can be here with us, thank you. So I have invited you to come along because you came along to one of our sessions at the Art and Agency Exploring Eco-Anxiety and Creativity workshop that we were running in Exeter with the University of Exeter. We've got a fabulous group of 10 creatives and people who hold groups who are exploring how eco-anxiety can affect them and their work and the groups that they're working with. And we invited you to come along and talk about what you do.
Yeah.
Which was fantastic. And everyone completely loved it. So we thought it would be really great if you'd be willing to share your presentation with anyone else who's interested online.
Yeah, thank you. I'm delighted to.
So before we do go into the presentation though, I wonder, when we invited you to think about art and agency and eco-anxiety and art, what were your thoughts?
Well, my first sense was I was really excited to be invited because I really feel with the climate emergency, everyone has something to bring and we need all hands on decks, So I've worked with scientists, and when I'm with the scientists, we talk about how we need the creatives in there as well, and it's about how we all join up together, which I think, there's no time that we need that more than we need that now. And I just feel that, the arts and creativity give us such an opportunity to reshape our stories and to think outside the box, which we really need right now, to come up with the things that are going to enable us to be resilient, to bring our best minds, bodies, spirits. We need it all. And I think, creativity gives us that kind of crucible to grow the ways forward, that may not be the ways forward that we thought they were going to be. And I think it is that it's sort of launching into the unknown, isn't it? Which
that definitely does seem to be something that's coming up the whole time in this series of sessions, is how we deal with uncertainty and how we deal with the unknown, and how we hold groups that are dealing with those issues. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why your presentation's been so useful, because most of us as practitioners haven't engaged with the psychology of anxiety before. And we have a sense that there's this thing called eco-anxiety. Those of us who work in the creative arts dealing with climate issues are encountering it as a difficulty and a theme regularly, but kind of what to do with it and how to, and what it actually is quite tricky. So I wonder, are you happy and ready to share your presentation?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to take this spotlight off me and I'm going to leave it with you.
Okay, grand. So if I share screen. So, Elephants in Stilettos is the title of my presentation, and I hope that will become clear why that's so. And I'm going to really focus on the impact of holding reflective space for other people, which we do in many walks of life. And progressing to the next slide, there's my first falter. So I guess the first thing is that we all come with many hats to this work. We all come with some knowledge, experience, but none of us are experts. And I suppose I step into this as a clinical psychologist, having worked with people for many years with long-standing health problems, trauma, anxiety, only now starting to think about how that can be applied to the challenges that we face with climate distress. But I'm also a mother, a carer. I have my own creative experiences in terms of sort of roundabout stories, which we'll come to later as well. And activism is part of my sort of journey as well. And within our many roles that we all take, we'll all have different parts of ourselves as well. So as you listen, I think it'd be really helpful if you could just hold in mind what roles you're bringing to this work, and also what parts of yourself are sort of in there. You know, we might have an analytical part, a sociable part, an irritable part, an anxious part. And I was just talking with Chloe before we started, you know, perfectionist part, you know, is something going to go wrong? An optimist, a creative, a rational. All of these different parts are welcome to this experience of learning that we're on together. And I think it's really helpful if we can hold all of those together as if we are somehow a compassionate manager or host or a compassionate coach, you know, trying to work with this team of our self in all its messiness and loveliness. So the different roles that we bring, we want to hold in mind, because we'll be holding space in all of these different roles, you know, as a parent, a friend, at work, creatively. I'm sure you can think of many others in which we hold space. You know, it's not a special skill that we don't do, that we need to learn. So what is holding space? Well, it's about really being there physically, mentally, and emotionally. And it's that sort of sense of being absolutely present for someone. So you're putting your focus on them and supporting them with their feelings and whatever they're with in that moment. So people often talk about kind of creating safe space. And that's fabulous if we can do that, because we know that we are able to really flourish when we feel safe and explore ourselves and explore ideas and practices. But we also know that actually for some people, feeling safe might not be part of their experience. And in those situations, we might want to think more about creating a space that is perhaps calm. You know, that's particularly if we're working or being with people who have been through very traumatic experiences or experiences, you know, such as racism throughout their lives. So there's often a sense of kind of bravery, you know, courage in stepping forward into this space. It can feel a bit like launching yourself out into the chasm. And the work can often feel quite deep, which can feel quite challenging. And I think this idea of holding liminal space is incredibly sort of important to think about. So liminality, we're thinking about being at a threshold. And, you know, I actually found the bit from Wikipedia really helpful. So it talked about that sense of people being in a state of change. You know, so in a ritual, you enter a space and you're going from one state to another. But in that place of transition, you have to stand at a threshold and enter a place of sort of unknowing, where you're really structuring, might be your identity, the time, the community, and a new sort of way of being. And if you think about it, you know, this idea of being in a period in which something like a social hierarchy or our cultures, beliefs, traditions are being really dissolved. And we're faced with this challenge of coming up with something new that is emergent, you know, it's not yet formed. that is exactly what the climate crisis is presenting us with, this period of kind of immense uncertainty. And with that, there's a huge ambiguity. Humans don't like uncertainty. We're always trying to nail it to something definite. So we're going to feel restlessness, fear, to be honest, a lot of discomfort, if not distress and anguish. And I think the last quote on this slide really captures for me that sense of the courage to launch into the unknown. So it talks about the space between when a trapeze artist lets go of one swing and doesn't yet know whether she'll be able to reach the other swing. And I think that's often what we're doing when we're trying to enter a place of creativity ourselves, or whether we're trying to hold space for others to do that. So ideas about holding in containment, well, what is that? And I think, the psychoanalysts have said a lot about holding in containment and what that involves. So they based a lot of their ideas on understanding what happens for a little baby when it's developing. And this idea that a little baby is, if you think about it, they're going to be filled with all of these experiences within their body, emotions that might feel quite overwhelming and challenging. They haven't got words or names for them. And that might feel quite unbearable at times. So the idea is that if a parent or other adult figure can hold space well enough, that enables that infant to start to be able to be with those difficult experiences, those emotions, in a way that makes them more kind of palatable. So one person in particular, Bion, talked about an idea that if you can be with someone who's distressed, be that the infants or with an adult, and you can really be with them and almost sort of take in their distress, and then you're creating, it might be the practice that you're doing, or it might be what you say, or it might be just you're being with them and the non-verbal responses that you give. That process then gives back to that person in a more palatable way the awful, distressing, overwhelming stuff that they were grappling with, and that could be what we're doing with climate distress as well. And Beyond developed their ideas to actually go on to think about the way that actually being in groups of people can provide a containing space as well. So then it's almost like the group or the practice that you're doing within the group offers the way of sort of processing and giving back to the individual their experiences in a more sort of formed way. And I think there's a lovely metaphor for this, which I find quite amusing, which is it's almost like if people give you potatoes, you're trying to find a way of mashing them and then giving them back in mashed potato form so that they can then be sort of consumed and integrated for that individual. And that's in a way what we're all trying to do with climate distress. And another of the analysts, Winnicott, talked about the way that when we're with people, we're sort of, by being with people in a very steady, calm way, in a safe way, we're providing a secure base, a safe haven that hopefully enables people to kind of venture off a little bit and explore. And then they might come back to you a little bit, and then they might go off and explore. And I think we can sort of see how that works when we're with, small children. But, to some extent that happens for us as adults as well when we're going into kind of difficult territory. So when we're thinking about holding space for emotions, this word cloud here is based on interviews with people about their emotions when they think about what's happening with the climate. So we can have this whole variety of different, sometimes quite challenging emotions. And also no emotions at all. So I've put that there because that's quite important, that some people may not be able to name or may have just an experience of sort of blankness. Not everyone's going to feel very distressed or very much of anything at all. And I think the important thing here is just allowing that whatever is there is okay. You know, whatever is there is a natural response, that we don't pathologize people's experiences or make them out to be sort of elements of, you know, mental illness in any way. So when we talk about anxiety, it's a normal, natural response to this immense threat that we are facing. But we do know that when people are sort of looking at when people are looking at trying to find a structure, a framework to hold emotions, that the more that we can provide this, the more it enables people to process what's going on. So we might provide a structure, for example, in terms of a specific time for the practice that we're doing. We might make that explicit. Or the structure could be in terms of the frame of the paper that we are using, if we're using paper. If we're in a group, we may have particular sort of ground rules that help provide a frame that make it safe to explore. Within, you know, within our communities, we may have different faiths or beliefs, and those provide a structure as well. But we know as well that, you know, being out, for example, in nature, that can provide a frame in itself. So whilst we're out, for example, on a walk, the structure of the walk may be the frame of what we're doing. The structure of that woodland could be the frame of what we're doing. If we're using a lens, you know, that will give some element of kind of containment. And I've also I was thinking about that word holding, and the idea came to mind for me of sort of a ship's hold as well. And I love that idea that, you know, if we went into a ship's hold and we were going on a journey, actually we'd be in that hold and it might be a bit dark and murky, and we'd have a sense that we're traveling somewhere, but we actually wouldn't know where we'd got to until we kind of opened up the hatch and came out again into the light. So within that framework, you know, there is that element of uncertainty. And of course, we're very much held by our connections and relationships. And I love this picture of the children working together where they've mapped out their relationships. So that's where the relationships that we build within our groups can be so important. So obviously, one way that I hold space is as a therapist, as a clinical psychologist, and I work with anxiety, grief, adjustment to illness, and within that experience of trauma as well. And all of that is hugely relevant to what we could meet with people when we're working with climate psychology. So, you know, people have talked about the experience of facing the climate and ecological crisis as being one of, you know, a universal trauma that we're all experiencing. So it can help us to understand a little bit about that. And when we are thinking about working with individuals, or indeed, you know, when we're doing the work ourselves, you know, when we're thinking about what's going on for us when we try to engage with these huge threats, we can think about the many layers at which we might be impacted. So we might need to think about, you know, as we try and lean into the challenges of what's happening with the climate crisis, what happens within our body? What do we notice there? And even just that noticing and naming is incredibly helpful. Moving up a layer, what happens psychologically, what happens in our thoughts, our beliefs, our emotions, our actions. And if we can just observe what's happening, you know, if we can give this idea of almost standing back and being that compassionate observer to ourselves, that's helpful. You know, we're operating within what's going on within our environment, within our social, cultural, political space, the climate around us. You know, the layers go out, don't they? You know, what's going on for us spiritually. And, you know, as much as we can notice what's going on in this moment right now, we are going to be impacted by what's happened in our own stories in the past and our sense of what our stories might hold for us in the future. So when we think about meeting with one other person, of course, that's going to double up. You know, we're all bringing our layers to this, and our roles, and the different parts of ourselves. And of course, in a group, we've got many more of these different sort of onions of our layers all overlapping. So this idea of, you know, just having like a little compassionate self on your shoulder watching. So if you think about holding space with one person or with a group of people and what's going on for ourselves and what's going on for them, it's a huge amount. It's a huge amount. And I think that's why it's so important that we just give ourselves credit for how hard and challenging this work can be. So while we might want to try and appear like that swan, you know, calm on the surface, we may often feel like we're paddling like mad underneath because we're trying to process, you know, all the cogs are going, trying to make sense of all these different layers of what's going on when we're in a space with our practice, you know, with other people. And, you know, sometimes just pausing and giving yourself a time to breathe and step back is important, because there's going to be a lot going on in that space. So the tasks of holding space, what are we trying to do? We're trying to give permission to others to trust their own wisdom and intuition. So we're going to be resourcing people with all the stuff that we're, you know, bringing into that space. And we're going to be supportive of them. Listening is going to be really important as we try to, you know, empower them. We're trying to help them find that agency, that ability to act within themselves. So it is about them, it's not about you. And I think within that, one of the things that can be so helpful is being able to notice our own urges to act and to try and hold in mind, is that urge, is that being driven by our own needs? It might be our own distress because we're finding it hard to be with what's difficult, or is it for the benefit of the other person? And it could be that as well, you know. So we need to be sort of cautious about jumping to action and problem solving. It doesn't mean that giving guidance isn't helpful, you know, but I think often the way that we give that can be helpful. So if we can sort of almost hold a sort of tentative quality to that, with sort of humility and thoughtfulness. And it's offering that space where we might succeed, we might fail, you know, we might be up against our own expectations about what good outcome there's going to be. So as much as we can, try to suspend judgment. And of course, as much as we can bring our warmth, kindness, compassion and curiosity to that, the more helpful it's going to be, because we know that bringing those qualities to create a space when there are complex emotions here, you know, might be fear, might be sort of quite traumatic experiences, is going to be valuable to people, help people feel calmer and more settled in themselves. And it's going to allow people to make decisions and go in directions that, you know, you might not have thought of and they might not have thought of themselves. So I love the idea of playfulness in this, you know, where appropriate, it can be so important. And that goes hand in hand with kind of braveness and the vulnerability that we bring to this as well. And that can be really hard to step into. You know, we're bringing openness, so open questions as much as we can, a kind of open body posture. And, you know, sometimes I kind of try and remind myself of that as well. If I feel myself naturally closing with anxiety or the threat of something, I'll try and very consciously kind of open up, because that opens up our minds as well in the moment. You know, and sometimes it's just about being with silence as well. So I love this, you know, and it talks about just giving space. So for the days when you can't put your heart into words, when those shapes on the page don't fit and those sound waves in the air don't have enough room for what you hold inside. Just to have someone sit with you in the quiet, and sometimes deafening wordlessness is simply everything. So just that being, we really need that in this work. And, you know, with this slide, please don't be overwhelmed by, there's a lot on this slide which you can come back to if it's helpful to you. But I just wanted to say something briefly about our responses to the face of threats, because that can be helpful to hold in mind too. So these are our natural human responses when we're faced with stuff that's threatening, when we're faced with things that cause us anxiety or distress. And these are survival responses that we've evolved through the course of history. So initially, some of you might have heard about the fight or flight response. And I think that's useful to hold in mind when we're working with people, that we may notice within ourselves or with other people a sense whereby people, you know, in a flight response go into a little bit kind of panicking, rushing, feeling quite driven. We've got to do here. We've got to get busier, got to get active. Or if people are feeling very threatened, they may go into that fight response. You know, they may get a little bit more kind of defensive, you know, on the combative. Or we might notice that arising in ourselves. Other responses that can happen that aren't so well known about, we can, for some of us, go into what I'm not sure I like the word, but it's been called the fawn response just because it's another F. But it's a more sort of people pleasing. So it's where we might become a little bit more kind of willing to just go with appease other people, go with what other people want, not say or do what we really feel is the way to go. And then if we actually go into a state where we feel really overwhelmed and, you know, and the threats are just too much, we could even go into a freeze response. And that's where we just shut down, you know, our mind goes blank, it's all too much, we want to withdraw. And we may well move in and out of these, or notice people moving in and out of these. So what we want to do on this slide, you see that there's a window, and we want to help people stay within a window of tolerance, because when we're engaging with this stuff, a little bit of stress is going to be there, and that can actually be quite mobilizing and help us towards agency. But we want to help people stay in a level where it's kind of not too much, not too little. It's sort of the Goldilocks zone, if you like. And we want to help people not tip into that hyper arousal where they're going to go into fight or flight, and also not to go into that one at the bottom, hypo arousal, where people start to shut down and they're overwhelmed. And I love this image and this idea that, you know, another way of thinking about this is, if we're practicing in the window of tolerance, it's a bit like being on a beach where we, you know, we want to be kind of really splashing around in the waves. You know, we're going to enter the waters of uncertainty, but we don't want to go too deep, because then we're going to feel like we're drowning. But we want to be in there a bit, splashing around, being playful, you know, the bit where the waves have still got some space where we can feel we're in a depth that works for us. We're okay. And we want to think about our capacity to hold others as well. And that's going to involve our ability to hold ourselves and all our parts. You know, so this image here, this idea of a teapot, as we pour out for others, as we support and hold space for others, we need stuff to be able to come in and resource us. So we need to think about, what do we need to help us regulate our emotions, to stay in that zone ourselves, and to look after ourselves. You know, And that might be an exercise you want to do, you know, just to go off and give yourself a little bit of space and think about what helps me stay in that zone, that Goldilocks zone, where I'm not too overwhelmed, I'm stimulated enough, but I'm, you know, equally, I'm not sort of disengaged. So thinking about space, you know, different examples of holding space. One of those is the Exeter Climate Cafes, where I'm a facilitator along with a group of other facilitators in Exeter. And we are linked with the Climate Psychology Alliance, where we've all trained. And you can find out more about those through our website and our Facebook group there. So these are spaces where, about an hour and a half, we provide a space where people can talk about their feelings and concerns. And we hold a framework with ground rules, and we sort of say a little bit in terms of the timing and expectations about what this space is about. And we provide some structure within that. And we provide, I suppose the creative aspect is often that we provide nature objects. And those often spark off a whole load of associations for people and enable people to connect in what feels like quite a safe way with their feelings and concerns about the climate and ecological crisis. And we end ourselves with a debrief amongst the facilitators. So that's our chance to look after ourselves after holding space. And, you know, just to think about experiences within these cafes, and this is where the elephant in stilettos comes in. So, you know, I can think about exchanges we've had within the cafes where, you know, people can bring a huge amount of distress, and sometimes, you know, things can happen in groups. So, you know, as a facilitator, for example, I found myself under attack, you know, in one situation, and I found that really helpful to be able to understand that in terms of actually this person is really distressed, and actually also remembering that this is someone who, you know, the person attacking me is someone who's actually turned up to talk about climate distress. So if you think about the you know, the broader populace, there's all those people out there who may be carrying distress at a conscious or unconscious level who haven't turned up. So the person who has turned up is carrying an element of all those people's distress. And then in that moment, talking with other people who are distressed, you get a kind of concentration effect. And sometimes if you're the one who's trying to hold that space, it's going to get kind of directed at you. You know, if that is almost too much for the people there to hold themselves. It's like people in groups sometimes go, here you have it, you have this horrible feeling because it's intolerable, it's too much for me. So they launch it at you. So it's really helpful to sometimes think, if that's happening in groups, about whether, you know, whether the distress that you might be feeling in the group, is that your distress, or is that actually the distress of other people that you've kind of a bit like a sponge absorbed, you know? So it's easy when you've been holding space for people to find yourself afterwards, you know, maybe feeling, oh, you know, you might feel really heavy, or you might feel really exhausted, or low even, or anxious. And to actually realize, actually, some of this might not be your stuff. It might be what other people have kind of always given you. And you might want some sort of practice to enable you to put it down. It might be writing it out, or you know, sometimes it's like I might do a movement practice like Tai Chi, or I might go for a walk afterwards. And it's just a way of trying to or sort of breathe it out. So it's like, this isn't mine, it's out of me. Or holding space in a crowd. This was in an activist role where I was speaking, but afterwards, at the big one, the event up in London a couple of weeks ago, and you know, a big crowds there. So I was conscious there that I was holding space for the group as I spoke, because I was speaking on behalf of, the ideas of some of the people there as well. So in an advocacy role. And I think sometimes when we do that as well, I came off and I was almost in tears, and some of that was mine, but some of that was about the emotion that was in the crowd. And it was helpful for me to remind myself of that. So what do we need? We need to hold these multiple levels of awareness, what's going on inside us, inside our mind and bodies. And it might be just like, for me, I often just think about my body. Where are my feet? Are my feet on the ground? What's happening to my breathing? Can I slow down my breathing, especially the out breath? Slow breathing, shoulders down. Can I ground myself? What's going on in the relationship? What's going on for the individual and what they're bringing? I'm trying to hold that sense of like a compassionate observer on my shoulder as I'm being present, thinking about that framework, those boundaries that we're setting in terms of who we are, how we've set up our practice, whatever we're doing, giving time for a debrief to look after ourselves afterwards, and seeking out the support that we need, because this is really challenging, tough work. So the grounding I've just mentioned, feet on the floor, feeling my sit bones on the seat below me. Sensory grounding as well is a useful one. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 would be 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can hear, 3 things that you can feel in your body, 2 things that you can smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. And that's often quite a nice exercise actually to do at the beginning of holding space, to try and enable yourself and your participants to become present. And when we're under threat as well, everything hardens up, doesn't it? So almost sort of consciously trying to hold that softness in our facial expression can be helpful for ourselves and others. Some of these other things on the slide here I've mentioned, but imagery that might actually be a kind of quite creative image. So I have an image of actually being, if I'm going into something that I'm feeling challenging, I might have a sense of, it's like anything goes here. So my one would be a very solid kind of Shire horse that is with me. It's solid, it's strong, it's alongside me. It's almost like that little big companion. And going back to where I started, that idea of being aware of different aspects of ourself. We might have parts of ourselves when we're doing this work that feel really anxious and upset by what we're engaging with. So I might sometimes have a sense of actually holding like little Becky, and that's okay. That little part of me it's okay, she can sit here. I'll give her a cuddle while, I'm kind of doing the work. And that's part of what we're doing together. So, we've gone back there. Let's go that way. Other ways of kind of being creative. So this was roundabout stories. And Chloe, when she was asking me to be involved, she said, "What's your practice?" And I said, "Oh, I don't think I've got a practice." And I said, "Well, I planted a roundabout." And I thought, oh yeah, well, that was in a way a practice that kind of evolved. So sometimes our practice may be one that's more emergent. And when I thought about it, I thought actually what happened was during lockdown, I linked up with some people from British Rail, and they had a small patch of kind of godforsaken derelict land that was very sad, and we got help from the council to clear it. And it became a frame. So the frame of the space was the roundabout itself, with all these roads around it. And what happened was local people came, so friends, local residents, all sorts of people stopped, and they'd come to this place and be engaged in the clearing. and we replanted it as a little wildflower meadow. So it was a place of transformation. It created this sort of sense of crucible where we were doing something, but alongside that, we could have conversations around the threat and uncertainty that we were facing at the time, which was COVID. But it also started to become conversations about what was happening with the climate crisis as well. And there was a sense of that sort of togetherness and connection amongst quite a sort of a disparate community. So it involved veterans who donated poppy seed, as I've mentioned, some other organisations, local residents, and we all came together around this space and created something that we hadn't foreseen would be like this, but has become something that is perhaps helps people then also engage more with nature and the natural world, which we know is important for people to take more sort of pro-environmental action and make pro-environmental choices. And of course, whatever we start, there will also be other spin-offs from this. So, I never knew that small act of agency, getting down on my hands and knees and starting to clear things, which was for me a sense of taking agency in the pandemic, would lead to loads of spin-offs. So, climate cafes, going to London, talking outside Parliament, being involved in this, talking with the Met Office. So we never know what we're starting when we begin any act of agency. And I love that sense of we're always just beginning stories. So, who knows what stories you're beginning in your own practice right now. And just to come back and end with that sense of transformation. So a beautiful Rilke poem, to quiet friend who has come so far, feel how your breathing makes more space around you. Let this darkness be a bell tower, and you, the bell. As you ring what batters, you become your strength. Move back and forth into the change. What is it like, such intensity of pain? If the drink is bitter, turn yourself to wine. In this uncontainable night, be the mystery at the crossroads of your senses, the meaning discovered there. And if the world has ceased to hear you, say to the silent earth, I flow. To the rushing water, speak, I am. And I love how that speaks to the creativity of holding space. And some other resources there, some questions to ask yourself. Think of a time when you were vulnerable. What did you need? Can you hold space for others? Can you be present with yourself? And what helps this? And as we come to an end, thank you so much. Thank you. And I hope that some of that is helpful to you.
Becky, thank you so much for sharing that wonderful, wonderful presentation. I can thoroughly recommend people watching it twice, because second time round it's just as good, if not better and richer, and there's so much more to pick up from it.
I think it's longer, Chloe, and I love the chance to be imperfect and go wrong a few times. That was great.
Me too. Me too. I wonder, just before we finish recording, I thought it would be, I'm just going to spotlight myself as well. I'm just being reminded by Jenny to spotlight myself too. Thank you, Jenny. So there are just a couple of questions that I thought would be nice to just finish up with, and I hope you don't mind me jumping in there. One of the things that I've noticed with all sorts of creative practice, arts practice that deals with climate issues is that there's a kind of calling to someone else to do something. There's a kind of a call to action in it. It's sometimes here's some information presented in this interesting way. We should all be acting. you should act. And I also notice that there's something around the fact that not everyone is able to act. And I wonder whether you've thought about or can, dealt with, that when is it okay to ask people to act? Or is it enough just to hold space for people to consider things?
I think that's a really, really, really important question. And, I think act often implies such a sort of sense of doing, and we really struggle with the being. And for me, they need to go very much hand in hand. And I think our culture and society is often interested in this one. It's interested in the being, and that we often feel we can only have a sense of value by, doing something that's very visible to others, or can be measured or quantified. And this is something that comes up a huge amount in the climate cafes, where we actually, one of our rules for the cafes is that although we might be involved in doing, this is a space that is about being and just trying to stay with our feelings. And that can be hugely challenging sometimes. So it's not to say that doing isn't important, but on balance, I think we often find it harder to give value to the process of being, certainly in the Western world as well. And also for people for whom, whatever their own situations are, that may be very difficult to always be presented with messages that you should be out there kind of doing. And I think that one of the other things we've often come back to within the cafes is how much value and also how much potency there is in terms of our ability to catalyze, I'm going to say ourselves and others, but I want to say it in the same, there isn't a word to say, it's like us together. Because I think sometimes when we can just stay with being and showing our struggle with people, not having to demonstrate expertise or that we've got the answers, sometimes we don't know how much we influence people by doing that, so I've actually been I felt really honoured, and I know my companion facilitators have within the climate cafes, by how many of the people who have come along to those cafes have perhaps come along with their carers, people who have come along who have sort of physical limitations, and or don't know what they want to do. And there's been actually huge power, and I would say agency, in them finding a voice. So, I would say don't underestimate what it is to find our voice. And our voice doesn't have to be a spoken one. I was listening to an amazing program on the radio the other day about people who had physically lost their voice finding a voice. So I think those acts of expression, creativity, whatever that is, it's like the butterfly effect. I feel like we never know what's going to resonate with someone else.
One of the things I really loved in your presentation, and is something I feel quite strongly about as well, is this suggestion that we shouldn't pathologize eco-anxiety. And of course, eco-anxiety is a completely irrational response to the situation that we find ourselves in. And I've heard people talk about moving from eco-anxiety to eco-excitement, or eco caring or eco enthusiasm or something like that. And you talked quite a lot about the holding space for people who are in that anxious place. But I wonder if you have any thoughts about how to support people to recognize that their anxiety is actually a sign of a positive relationship with the earth and others, and whether there's anything in creativity and creative practice that can help us shift into the eco excitement, eco enthusiasm state.
Yeah, I think those ideas of shifting are really important. Again, I think we have to hold those, sometimes we have to hold those lightly because we don't want this to become a frame to rushing to those. I think that it can often be just hugely valuable to name that these are normal feelings. And I often find just sharing these are normal feelings, and that we have normal feelings of anxiety when we are losing something that we care about. You know, in terms of infants, we understand that an infant will become distressed, will grieve, will become anxious, will shout out, might become a bit agitated if they're losing something that they care about. So naming that with people, I think, is really helpful. Connecting with others. So we know that humans, we're sociable beings, you know, we are, humans aren't designed to be in isolation. So that the more that we connect with others, the more that often helps us to regulate our anxiety as well. You know, we don't all need to rush off to have individual therapy. You know, we know in cultures that have been severely traumatized, you know, after, you know, the Rwandan atrocities that happened, you know, therapists went out and tried to talk to people in individual sort of huts and, you know, tents and things. And the people said, you know, why do people keep taking me into a hut to talk about these awful things that I've happened? You know, I need to be with other people, sharing and, you know, singing and dancing, whatever, you know, that was culturally appropriate for those people at that time. But certainly we know that connection is hugely valuable. A lot of people can feel regulated by that. For people who've had traumatic experiences, it may be that connecting with people might not feel safe, but they may find that connecting with nature or with animals could be the thing that helps to regulate them. So knowing it's normal what I experience, it makes sense, it's because I care. And then I think, you know, it's a normal process of grieving or working through distress, that when we have found a way of recognizing those emotions, giving them some space, it's a bit like those waves. If you think about going through grief, when any of us have had any grief, we'll have times when the waves feel really big, and then times when the waves of grief come back, and then there'll sort of be a time when we suddenly start to think, oh, maybe my life maybe I can start to re-engage in something in a different way. So I think, you know, we can't skip the painful bit, and there's no prescriptive about how long that lasts, but certainly it may be just the naming of it that then is enough, that then enables us to go, okay, now I can re-look at my map, you know, a bit like on my talk, where when I was on the roundabout, I was actually lost in grubbing around in the earth, and I was in my distress about the pandemic. And now further down the line, again, this ability to zoom out, I think as soon as we can sort of step back and think and talk about what we're doing, then sometimes that gives a sense of, oh, new directions or new stories. Also, So I was feeling really anxious and distressed and overwhelmed about the climate crisis. And now I understand where this distress has come from, and it makes sense. You know, I can see that actually I can bring something of value, and that's a new story to tell. That's one about being an agent of change and bringing. I can't remember the words you used, but it was about that sort of more caring connection in a way forward, but a compassionate motivation. And I think, you know, compassion can be hugely helpful. We are compassionate because we care, but compassion often involves doing difficult things as well, leaning into difficult things. So I mentioned that acts of courage and bravery as well. So when we lean into this stuff, you know, that's the hardest thing. And we move towards what's difficult. Sometimes we'll be surprised what's there. You know, so
my last question, what I was reading recently, that 79% also young people particularly feel eco-anxiety and experience eco-anxiety. I've heard parents or grandparents worrying about that level of eco-anxiety and actually wanting to just remove the pain and wanting to remove the anxiety. And obviously one doesn't want anyone to suffer unnecessarily or overly suffer. But I wonder, and I think maybe even in our culture we're not very good at staying with the pain, or staying with the shame or the guilt or we are fragile humans. And I wonder if you have any thought whether that kind of scale of eco-anxiety is something that you've noticed. And I also wonder whether you think there's any ways that we can help people understand that being with the discomfort is okay.
Yeah, it's so important, because we know that it is the younger cohorts and generations that are feeling more distressed, and particularly the research is telling us that an element of that distress is a sense of feeling betrayed by our systems and the people who have power and who have agency. There's that sense of sort of institutional betrayal. So having spoken with some of the people in sort of younger groups who are more active, one of the things that people have said can be really helpful is simply for people to give voice to what is happening. And that comes back to one of the earlier questions, really, you know, the power of bearing witness to. So it doesn't have to be big acts of doing. But those younger people have said that they can feel more supported by just knowing, even if people can't fix it, that they will bear witness to, be with, you know, say, I understand, you know, we can speak about this. We are in this together, and we haven't got big fixes. And there might, you know, if there are small things that we can do, you know, sometimes that can help to give people a sense of agency. But one of the most powerful things is just having conversations. And so maybe a bit like your earlier question, just encouraging those younger people that even by talking, we don't know how we're going to be influencing people, you know. So I mean, I can remember you know, when I was sort of 15, it was the nuclear threats that we were facing in the 80s, and I can remember talking about that with classmates, and someone contacted me years later and said, oh, you had a really big influence on me. I couldn't even remember, you know, but clearly I'd had a conversation one day, or I'd mentioned it, or it had just given permission. So I'd say don't underestimate that. There is support. The Climate Psychology Alliance runs discussion circles for younger people, and also for parents and carers. And they will hold space as well for those conversations to help people. And they've got some great resources as well. So I'd really look there.
Oh, Becky, thank you ever so much for sharing your wonderful presentation and your wonderful tacit insights, knowledge. It's really great. And we look forward to continuing to have a conversation with you. I'm going to press stop now.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure.